Hello and welcome to the Chayrion Podcast, your guide to everything concerning the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond.
Good morning, good afternoon. Let me introduce my colleague from the National University of Public Service, Erzsébet N. Rózsa, who's a university professor. And my name is László Csicsmann, University Professor at the Corvinus University of Budapest. And in this podcast, we would like to discuss, I would say, the global, the regional, and the local developments in one of the most important sub-region of the Middle East, which is the Persian Gulf region. And let me start my questions from the global perspective, that there is a crisis of the liberal international order, an emerging multipolar world order where many global players penetrating the region, including China, Russia, the European Union, India as well. So how you see the Persian Gulf from a global perspective?
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for talking to me on this very important subject. I think in the past 2 years or so, maybe 3 years now, everyone dealing with international relations has been talking about a new global order, a new international order, which has been characterized by such terms as apolarity, when we cannot say that there is just one political corner or pole of the global system. We could even say that there is a kind of a multipolarity which may be different from topic to topic. Like, for example, if we speak about military issues, then definitely it is the United States, one and only, even more. But if it is economy, then we have to mention China, maybe even India or Russia even. But if you bring up such issues as environment, the care about environment, that is environment protection, then the European Union definitely is among the leaders. So the world is becoming much more complex, and in different sectors differently complex. And in this world, our region, the Middle East, or now we have broken it down to the Persian Gulf, is undergoing or has been undergoing very important changes. But at first, let me define the Persian Gulf. It's a body of water, obviously. The western shore of it is occupied mostly by the Islamic Republic of Iran, with an ancient statehood going back several thousands of years. The northern edge of the Persian Gulf is Iraq, which again has several thousand years of history. And then the eastern side of the Persian Gulf is populated by 6 bigger or smaller Arab states, starting from north going to the south: Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. These are the states also of the Arab Peninsula. There is one more state on the Arab Peninsula, which is Yemen, but it is far away from the Persian Gulf itself. Now, this area, the Persian Gulf, has been an area populated ever since the ancient times, and it has been characterized by such trade and naval activities going back to ancient times as our Mediterranean. We usually do not hear about it. Odysseus was definitely not going around in the Persian Gulf, but trade has been going on the one hand, because of the already mentioned ancient civilizations. On the other hand, because the Persian Gulf is opened through the Strait of Hormuz to the Arab Sea and the Indian Ocean, and Indian traders, and sometimes even 1 or 2 Chinese ventures, although Chinese historically were very rarely appearing here, has been going on in the region. So this is the Persian Gulf, which is then a very specific and a very important place. And may I ask you back now, because you are the economist, that the Persian Gulf is also the place where the biggest volume of trade and oil, of natural gas LNG and also oil is coming and going. Would you tell us a few words about that?
Yeah, I think especially from the global perspective, it's very interesting to see that the United States is not anymore dependent directly on the Persian Gulf oil or natural gas assets, although it imports from the Saudis, from Saudi Arabia mainly, some percent of its import. But the United States very recently with this shale gas industry became one of the largest exporter of energy. China is a different case because China, India, directly dependent on the Middle Eastern region. And especially it's important to mention the case of China. Around 50% of Chinese oil import originated from the Persian Gulf, including definitely Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates as well. And natural gas is important, but the shipping is with LNG is a bit different issue, and for China, definitely Central Asia and Russia is there. But not only oil and natural gas is important from the region, but because of the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia and similar projects in the United Arab Emirates about diversification of the economic portfolio of those countries, I think the sovereign wealth funds are very important source of global influence of those wealthy states, those wealthy Arab monarchies in the region, because they can invest a lot financially in other countries. So I would say that it's a global source of influence for those countries, and definitely the economic engagement is mainly in Asia. So we used to call it as the Asianization of the Persian Gulf. As you mentioned rightly, that the United States remains the main security provider of that region. However, all economic activities closely connected to major Asian economies, including Russia as well, India as well. And very recently it was announced at the G20 meeting in New Delhi last year in September that the project of IMEC connecting between India, Middle East, which means India, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, to Europe, which is, I would say, from a Washington's perception, it's a rival project to China's BRI project. Of course, the Indian perception is a bit different, but here, especially we're discussing the Persian Gulf issues.
Yes, and you mentioned this Asianization of the Persian Gulf, which is one characteristic development in the Persian Gulf. You mentioned the Belt and Road coming from China. You mentioned this brand new project. We don't know what is happening at this stage with the Gaza conflict in the background, but India also has another project, the North-South Transit Corridor, coming from India through Iran through Russia, to Europe, which again, because of the Russian-Ukrainian war, has been halted. So Asianization, I think, in the Persian Gulf as well, from an economic point of view, a very important thing. But we have to add that this kind of definitely visible influence of some Asian countries, first of all China, but India is coming up. But we can mention Japan and South Korea on a much lower scale. But this does not mean that these countries would be ready to take over the security provider role of the United States. And this is very important. But this also means another thing. It means that the Persian Gulf countries, by the way, others too, because this goes for Israel too, a new development in the Middle East seems to be that these countries do not have to choose between sides. And this has been first relevant to us with regard to the war in Ukraine, the Russian war in Ukraine, when the Western world and Europe went for sanctions against Russia these countries, including Israel, which is proud of being the number one ally of the United States in the whole of the Middle East, these countries did not go with these sanctions. And they let it understand that this is not our war. We do not have to choose. Or we can mention it that with regard to the American policy coming in, I think most visibly under the Trump presidency, but going on under the Biden presidency too, that the United States has to compete with China. Yes, they are competing, but China does not want to take over the security provider. For China, it is a very convenient thing that the United States is providing security, military security in the Persian Gulf, but in other parts of the region or in other parts globally as well, because this ties down forces by the United States. So Asianization is an interesting issue, very important issue, but it also means that even US allies do not have to choose between competitors, US competitors.
Yeah, that's a very interesting issue given the fact that US can force those states to behave in a right manner. And especially we have to mention that even Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are vulnerable economically from many perspectives, including supercomputers, microchips, semiconductors. They need to build their own industry, and without the United States or without China, it's of course not possible. And just several months ago, I learned from the news that one of the US companies or the United States not allowed to sell different things to those countries, especially because they are quite close to Russia. So of course, it's Washington's goal is to force their allies to take sides, which of course those countries are not interested in to do. But let me continue with a question, because you mentioned China's role as mainly an economic player in the region, but it was China which mediated in the Iranian-Saudi conflict last year. So the restoration of the diplomatic relations between the two major countries in the Persian Gulf. So it seems that it's China's success and not Washington's success.
I would be very cautious with this statement, because before the announcement, definitely from Beijing, that the Saudis and the Iranians could come to some kind of an agreement and the restoration of their diplomatic relations, which is very important. But this was preceded by 5 or 6 previous rounds of negotiations in Iraq, in Baghdad, and in Oman. So in fact, the Chinese were providing the scene for the last announcement, the last moment. Obviously, this is very important. This is again not only important for China, but also for Saudi Arabia and Iran. But I am not sure that it was one and only, and it was only their success. Obviously, the Chinese took the show and the limelight, but we have to wait for others. So I think one such case is not enough to draw the conclusion that from now on China will be the big mediator. And since then, we have seen issues in which China just does not want to interfere. Here is the Israel's issue, war in Gaza. So I think this is one thing, but I think this also leads me a little bit to another concept which you mentioned in the very beginning, the Gulfization, the role of the Persian Gulf. And on the one hand, I understand it as a Persian Gulf issue or Persian Gulf actors being able to put an item on the international agenda. This is one thing. The other thing is that within the broader Middle East, I think this is the first phase in history when the Persian Gulf region was leading the whole, was stepping up as the leader of the wider Middle East. But we also have to be very clear about definition, because about Gulfization, and when we just say the Gulf, in Iran, they would tell us to speak about the Persian Gulf. But when we meet the Gulf, we usually refer to these 6 Arab Gulf states, which I mentioned, who formed in 1980 or 81, they formed the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC for short, yet again, namely Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. And this was at the time a very pragmatic step, because we could say that in the last, let's say, 1 century or so, the Persian Gulf political situation was usually depending on 3 great powers, Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. But from 1980 to 88, Iraq and Iran were involved in a long, protracted, very bloody war. And these other Arab Gulf states came to form the Gulf Cooperation Council exactly to kind of deter these other 2 military-minded or militarily involved countries. So this Gulfization, when we speak about Gulfization, we usually speak about the GCC countries and their role farther away. I mean, when have we seen it in history that we saw it in the aftermath of the Arab Spring events in Libya, for example, that Arab Gulf states like the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris appear with air force and take part in a conflict. So,
and not only in the Middle East, but just think about the Ethiopian internal conflict with the Tigray rebellion,
Sudan,
and Iran is active too there.
Yes,
so, is it right to say that we see a simultaneous cooperation and conflict at this moment in the Persian Gulf?
I think at the moment it is rather going towards a kind of a normalization. And the biggest reason is that practically no one could entirely succeed in their own plans. This is one thing. And the other thing is that it turned out that the security umbrella or the security provider role of the United States was not operating properly. We have to remember that a few years ago, some drones were hitting in the Saudi territory an oil refinery and an oil field. And while the Saudis were expecting that President Trump and the United States would come to protect them, President Trump didn't come. And there were other issues, and there was even one instant when President Trump tweeted, he liked to use the tweet, he tweeted that there was a military operation on the point of opening towards Iran, and then in the last few minutes or hours, he stopped it and he gave the order to stop it. So this is also related to this external situation that the states within the Gulf have come to realize that, in fact, their own security will depend on them, and you cannot choose your neighbor. So you have to somehow coexist. It doesn't mean that they will love each other and so on and so forth, but they will have to coexist for several reasons. One is the already mentioned oil and gas trade. The other thing is the movement of peoples. Then another thing is religious tourism, which is going Sunnis or all Muslims going to Mecca, Shiites going to the Shiite sanctuaries in Iraq and in Iran. But we can also mention such practical issues like Kuwait being 50 kilometers away from Iran and the Kuwaiti concerns about the safe operation of the Iranian nuclear power plant. This is another issue. Or we can also mention the fact that under the water, in the ground of the Persian Gulf. The gas fields do not observe national boundaries. So, for example, there is one huge gas field underwater, which part of it belongs, according to the international naval law or law of the sea, belong to Qatar. The other part belongs to Iran. They must cooperate.
Yeah. You mentioned Qatar. Could you please elaborate a bit on the Qatari diplomatic crisis between or within the GCC, I would say, between Saudi Arabia and Qatar?
Yes, 2017 was the year when within the GCC there was the most severe split ever since 1981. And this meant that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, together with some countries out of the Gulf, like Egypt, for example, which was very important, gave 12 conditions to Qatar, which Qatar should fulfill. Otherwise, it is isolated from the GCC. The main concerns were the relations of Qatar, for example, to the Muslim Brotherhood in general and to Hamas in particular. We were referring to it in a previous podcast, but also such issues like the TV channel Al Jazeera, which was open to everyone who wanted to criticize politicians, statesmen, countries, states, and so on. And there were other conditions as well. So Qatar was isolated from the GCC with all these conditions. And in fact, it was very easy to isolate it on land because it has just one part of it, which is connected on land with Saudi Arabia. There were such trade issues like the camels used to go over from one country to the other to be grazed and so on and so forth.
Not respecting the borders.
Not respecting the borders, but also air routes. For example, Qatar Airways routes had to be diverted, but also we could mention the shipping of LNG and other things. So it was a very serious thing.
After?
Turkey and Iran came to help Qatar and provide some aid. But in fact, what happened was that the Qataris could survive. And in a way, one of their tools to come out of this conflict was their increased activities in mediation. And what we see now with regard to Israel and the Gaza Strip and Hamas, previously the Taliban, and even previously others between the US and Iran and so on, Sudan as well. So there are several issues, which means that it seems that Qatar has built up itself as a mediator in several conflicts, even of global scale. So the last one was between the United States and Venezuela. Who would think that tiny Qatar would help? There was also some exchange of prisoners there. Tiny Qatar could do it, but it seemed that this was one thing. The other was sports diplomacy. Don't forget that last year there was the World Football League Cup taking place in Qatar. So Qatar successfully built up its own reputation as an actor on the international scene, and this was its way out of the conflict. So this was a very specific tool of conflict resolution, and it ended in 2021 with Qatar being yet again embraced into the fold of the GCC without any of the 12 conditions fulfilled. So it is very interesting.
And it's very interesting that yesterday there was the news about prisoners exchange in the Russian-Ukraine war, which was mediated by the United Arab Emirates. So it seems there is a competition, I would say, still among the member states of the region of the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Yes, there is and there has been always a kind of a competition. So we should not understand that the Gulf Cooperation Council has ever been homogeneous, has ever acted as one alliance. It was much more a loose kind of a coalition, rather deter Iraq and Iran at the time. And we also know that they have lagged behind. They were planning to introduce a joint citizenship. They wanted to introduce a joint currency. These have not been realized. They wanted to introduce a joint military force, which has come to be established much, much, much later. And even then, in a very loose way, as far as I know, there has been one instance when this was used. It was in the Bahraini Arab Spring, when there was like 2,000 or maybe even less forces that were sent into Bahrain to help the ruler to put down the revolution, the demonstrations. And even that was much more like police forces and so on and so forth. But now the different analyses are saying that it seems that the Saudi umbrella has been restored to a certain extent, and there has been a kind of a division of labor among the different actors, that the Saudis are carrying on with the all Arab and even Islamic issues, and they represent the Arab world and the Islamic world to the public and in international fields, while the Qataris have taken on this international mediating role, but they also went down to contact and to talk to the United Arab Emirates, so there is some coordination among themselves. And so yet again, a kind of maybe only temporary understanding among the GCC state has come back to the fore.
Thank you. And you referred to the Arab Spring. So I think regime stability is one of the most important goals of all the members of this region. And very recently, there was an terrorist attack in Iran. A few days ago, which was claimed by the Islamic State. Would you please a bit explain, because not much news we receive nowadays from Iran. We know that there were protests in September 2022 and after, but very recently we do not have much news about those protests, but it was a surprising news to see an Islamic State terror attack within Iran.
Yes, I think that there are several trends that should be mentioned here. One is that the demonstrations that were started, I think about maybe now 3 years ago, 3 years ago, exactly, which started over the women's issue, but which moved the whole of the society. And it somehow came to settle down, but with very serious social changes. There have been two parts of Iran where demonstrations and even sometimes military intervention was still going on. That was in the western part of Iran, in the Kurdish regions. But then even further, even maybe to this day, although very little can be known about that, it is in the southern eastern part of Iran, Sistan, Baluchistan. This is the neighboring huge province with Pakistan, where the Baluch have always been a difficult segment of the Iranian society. A relatively huge territory, relatively few people, and they are Sunnis in Iran, which is about 90%, 89-90% of which of the population is Shiite. So even Sunnis itself is a different thing. Plus the Baluch have had for decades the desire, the political movements of gaining independence, which does not only depend on Iran, but also on neighboring Pakistan. So that is another issue. And then there have been these mysterious attacks in Iran for over a decade now. And these attacks either were aimed at different infrastructures, different parts of infrastructure which was involved in the Iranian nuclear cycle, which is to this day is civilian, like an mysterious explosion in Natanz, in the uranium enrichment facility, and so on. Or The other direction of these attacks were scientists, usually nuclear scientists, who were liquidated time and again, some of them in Iran, some of them outside of Iran. And then within this series of liquidations, probably the most important one was 2 years ago when General Qasem Soleimani was liquidated in Baghdad, at the Baghdad airport. Now, Qasem Soleimani was the head and the mastermind of organizing, of building out relations to the different militias, armed groups, and some governments like Syria, sometimes Iraq, in Lebanon, the Hezbollah, and even Hamas, time and again. This was not always continuous, but time and again. And he was the mastermind behind it. He was a generally liked and acknowledged person in Iran. And he was liquidated. And it was not very clear at that moment why he was in Iraq. If we can believe the words of the Iraqi prime minister at the time, he said that he was going on a mediation mission between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So in a way, this was questioned by many in the region, if his liquidation. And by the way, there was also a legal point. I mean, if there is no declared war between two countries, you usually do not liquidate an official part of the establishment. But then this event to which you were referring to happened on the 4th anniversary of his death. I think it was 2 days ago.
Yes,
2 days ago. And he was buried in Kerman, which is towards the southern eastern part of Iran. And on the anniversary of his martyrdom, as we should refer to it in the Iranian narrative, on the anniversary of his martyrdom, people went to visit his grave and remember him. And it was there that a huge terrorist attack happened. And this time it seems that it is still some remnants of the Islamic State of Khorasan, which you remember as well as I do. When last year we were in Iran, in the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they were telling us that one of the biggest threats to Iranian security was the Islamic State Khorasan. And here we have this terrorist attack.
Yesterday I saw the President Ibrahim Raisi on the Iranian television, and he blamed Israel, of course, for conducting this terror attack. What do you think about it? Why it's in the Iranian narrative to speak about Israel's interference in that?
I think it could be expected. What would anyone expect when the terrorist attack was performed by Hamas? Everyone was saying it was Iran. So this goes vice versa. But I am not sure. On the one hand, we will never know the truth about these things. This is one thing. But on the other hand, support here, support there, invisibly, in indirect ways, with several stations in between, you will never be able to follow who is related to whom and which terrorist attack or which incident was in fact initiated by whom.
Thank you very much for your answers. And it's very interesting news that many countries from the Persian Gulf very recently joined to BRICS, which we forget to analyze, which is quite important. But maybe, it's namely Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and not from the region. We should mention, of course, Egypt and Ethiopia as well. Argentina at this moment decided not to join to this club, so only 5 members joined to the BRICS, and definitely this is a new level of global game, I would say, for these countries. It's an opportunity in this evolving multipolar world order. So thank you so much, and
thank you very much.
The next podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayrion podcast. We are looking forward to sharing with you more exciting news on the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. For further information, please follow us at khayrion.com as well as on X and LinkedIn.